Neo and Trinity were never just movie characters to me. They were the faces I grew up watching when life felt heavier than it should for someone my age. Proof that ordinary people could stand up to impossible systems and somehow still choose love. The studio lights are blinding, but the audience can't stop staring at the two figures walking onto the stage. He's in a simple black blazer, hair a little longer than last time the world saw him. She's in a sleek black dress, shoulders squared, eyes soft but sharp. Years have passed since they dove through slow-motion bullets and crumbling realities. Yet as they sit down on the blue couch of The Tonight Show, there's a strange electricity in the room, like the Matrix might still be humming just beneath the studio floor. He gives that small, almost shy smile, and his first instinct is to thank everyone. The crew, the host, the people watching at home. She reaches for his hand, just for a second, an anchoring touch nobody was supposed to notice, and suddenly the whole audience leans in, sensing there's more beneath the polished surface of late-night banter. The host cracks a joke about jacking back into the Matrix. The crowd laughs, but behind their shared smile there is a quiet weight, a history of private battles that no camera has ever fully captured. Because when the world thought their story had ended with one last blinding flash of green code, their real lives were only just beginning to fracture. The man who once played a savior was learning how hard it is to save yourself from grief that doesn't follow a script. The woman who embodied fearless rebellion was waking up every day to a different kind of fight. The slow erosion of confidence that comes when the industry politely suggests you're past your prime. They both arrived at this couch carrying invisible scars, and tonight, under the glittering New York skyline backdrop, both are quietly deciding how much of that truth they're ready to reveal. The interview starts lightly. Memories from the first film, the heavy leather coats, the impossible stunts, the jokes between takes. But then the host, sensing a deeper vein, leans forward and asks with disarming gentleness, "Was there ever a moment you thought you'd never come back to this world, to Neo and Trinity?" The question hangs in the air like a held breath. He glances at her, she glances at him. This is the moment when most guests would pivot, toss out a rehearsed anecdote, keep it safe. Instead, he exhales, eyes lowering for the briefest flicker, as if he's seeing a memory that still hurts to touch. "I didn't think I'd come back to a lot of things," he says quietly, voice a shade rougher than the audience expects. The crowd falls completely silent, the laughter gone, replaced by a tightening in 1,000 chests. She nods almost imperceptibly, and the camera catches it, a tiny gesture of solidarity that hints at nights spent talking in trailers, on lonely hotel balconies, at hospital waiting rooms no fan will ever know about. The host opens his mouth to ask more, but then she leans toward the microphone, eyes gleaming with a mix of fear and resolve, ready to confess the one decision that changed both of their lives and almost destroyed the legend of Neo and Trinity forever. He remembers the night her message appeared on his phone, a single line glowing in the dark of his apartment. "I said no today." At first, he thought it was about some ordinary offer, another script, another interview. But when he called her, her voice was unsteady in a way he almost never heard. She told him the studio had finally come with a real proposal, a new chapter, a big budget, a chance to bring Neo and Trinity back to a generation that mostly knew them through memes. And she had turned it down, not because she didn't love the story, not because she didn't trust him, but because somewhere along the way she had stopped believing she still belonged on a screen that big. On the couch under the Tonight Show lights, she doesn't tell the audience everything, but she gives them enough to feel the sting. She describes sitting alone in her kitchen when the call came, being told how exciting it would be to see Neo return, how nostalgic fans would feel, and then almost as an afterthought, "Oh, and of course, we're thinking of including Trinity in some way." That phrase, "in some way," echoed in her chest long after the call ended. It sounded like a footnote to her own life, like the world had quietly decided she was now a supporting detail in a story she helped build. When she finally chokes out, "So I said no," the studio audience doesn't laugh. They shift in their seats, unsure how close they are to a truth they live in their own smaller, private ways. He remembers his own reaction, a long silence on the phone followed by a gentle, almost whispered, "Thank you for telling me." Because while the world adored him as a symbol of strength and calm, he had been avoiding his own reflection for months, skipping events, letting messages pile up unanswered. After the loss that had hollowed out his heart years earlier, acting had become something delicate, almost dangerous. Every set felt like a place where he might suddenly fall apart in front of strangers. The idea of stepping back into Neo's boots felt like stepping into an old life he wasn't sure he had the courage to face. Hearing that she had turned it down first, out of fear she no longer mattered enough, cut through his own quiet dread. Her doubt felt like a mirror, and he didn't like what it showed him. Back in the studio, the host leans forward, voice softer now. "What changed?" he asks. "You're both here, the movie exists, something must have shifted." She smiles, but it's not the easy, camera-ready smile, it's the careful one that comes after a hard decision. She tells them about the email that arrived weeks after her no, sent not by an executive, but by a young assistant she barely remembered meeting. A short note that simply said, "I grew up watching Trinity. I cut my hair like you. I signed up for self-defense because of you. Please come back, we still need you." The assistant had no power, no authority, just a small, trembling courage to reach out as a fan and as a woman. That kindness, that humble, almost anonymous plea, shook something loose inside her that the big studio pitch never could. But even that wasn't enough, she admits, looking over at him. The truth is, she only reconsidered when he finally called her again, voice hesitant, to share a secret he had told no one in the industry. A promise, made in a hospital corridor to someone he loved, about what he would do if he ever had the chance to play Neo again. A promise that had nothing to do with money or fame or nostalgia, and everything to do with healing a wound that had never really closed. On the couch, the audience waits, leaning forward as if they can pull the words out of him by sheer will. He swallows, glances at the floor, and when he lifts his eyes, they shine with something raw, something unguarded. "I didn't want to break that promise," he says, voice barely above a murmur. "But keeping it meant I might lose Trinity." The host blinks, caught off guard. "Lose how?" he asks carefully. Neo's actor opens his mouth to answer, but the memory hits so hard he has to look away for a heartbeat, fingers curling together in his lap. Beside him, she turns slightly toward him, ready to back him up if he falters. He inhales, steadying himself, and prepares to reveal the one condition he gave the studio, the demand that could have destroyed the entire film before a single frame was shot. He had walked into the studio conference room expecting glossy storyboards and polished pitches, but what he found were numbers, market projections, demographic charts, a list of legacy IP revivals that had either failed or exploded. They spoke about Neo like he was a brand instead of a broken man who had once believed in impossible things. When they finally asked what it would take to bring him back, he could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. He thought of the hospital corridor, the soft beeping of machines, the hand that had squeezed his with fading strength. "If you ever do Neo again," that voice had whispered, "don't let it be just about him. Let it be about the two of you. Show them what love can survive." So he looked the executives in the eye and said the one sentence that made every smile in the room freeze. "I don't come back without her, and Trinity doesn't come back in some way. She comes back as the heart of the story." On the Tonight Show couch, the audience lets out a low ripple of surprise, sensing the tension behind his calm delivery. He doesn't detail every argument, but you can hear it in the way his words slow down. He tells them how the room shifted, how one executive glanced at another, how someone mentioned risk and audience expectations, how they floated the idea of younger characters, spin-offs, safer bets. He had felt the old insecurity rise in his chest, the one that whispered he should be grateful for any offer after all these years. But grief had taught him something brutal and precious. Life is too short to say yes to stories that betray the people who made you who you are. So, with a quiet courage that surprised even him, he repeated, "No Trinity, no Neo." Not as a threat, but as a line in the sand to protect someone he cared about more than his own spotlight. What he doesn't say on air, but feels in his bones as he glances at her, is how terrified he was afterward. The moment he walked out of that glass tower, the city felt too big, the sky too bright. What if they called his bluff and moved on without him? What if he had just thrown away the one chance to turn his pain into something meaningful? Nights became long stretches of second-guessing. He replayed their old scenes together, the rooftop leaps, the whispered conversations in dark ships, and wondered if he had imagined the balance between them. Maybe the world really only wanted Nia. Maybe he was dragging her into a fight she hadn't asked for, risking her being rejected all over again. Kindness is rarely simple. Sometimes it's a heavy choice that keeps you awake at 3 a.m., wondering if your loyalty is actually harming the person you're trying to protect. She had her own war unfolding. After his call, after hearing what he'd said to the studio, she sat on her couch surrounded by old photos, a younger version of herself in black leather, eyes fierce and unafraid. Part of her wanted to hide, to let the offer pass and stay safe in the familiar rhythm of smaller roles, quiet days, and the comfortable invisibility that came with being remembered fondly but not needed. Another part, the part that had once jumped off cables and learned impossible fight choreography just to prove she could, was furious. Furious that she'd nearly let people who didn't even know her decide she was done. Furious that he had been the one to draw a line for her when she'd been too tired to pick up the pen herself. Courage, she realized, didn't always look like slow-motion kicks. Sometimes it looked like answering the phone and saying, "Okay, if you're in this with me, I'll try again." When the studio eventually called back, their tone had shifted, just slightly but enough to feel. They spoke of reimagining the narrative focus, of elevating Trinity's arc, all the safe corporate phrases that tried to hide the simple human truth. Two people had refused to betray each other, and now a massive machine was bending, however reluctantly, to that loyalty. But their relief was cut with a new fear the audience doesn't see right away, the fear that now, with this second chance, they could fail publicly, completely. What if the film came out and people said, "We didn't need them back"? What if Trinity's expanded role drew criticism instead of celebration? He worried that his demand might paint a target on her. She worried that her doubts might drag down his legacy. Yet underneath all that anxiety, a fragile, glowing thread of resilience began to weave between them again, the same thread that had carried them through long nights on the original set. On the Tonight Show stage, the host listens, unusually quiet, as they describe those months of uncertainty, script drafts arriving at odd hours, training sessions that left them bruised and breathless, moments in front of the mirror where they stared at their own faces and asked, "Can I still do this?" The audience laughs gently when she jokes about sore muscles and him stretching endlessly before every stunt, but there's a shared recognition in the room. Everyone knows what it feels like to wonder if their best days are behind them. Then the host asks, "Was there a single moment on set when you realized, 'Yes, we were right to come back'?" The question lands like a stone dropped into deep water. For a heartbeat, they both fall silent, trading a look loaded with something unspoken. Because that moment, the true turning point, didn't happen in a spectacular action scene. It happened in one small, quiet rehearsal, when a simple line of dialogue unexpectedly cracked them both open and nearly shut the whole production down. They were rehearsing a quiet scene, nothing flashy, just Neo and Trinity sitting across from each other, speaking like two people who had seen too much and still weren't sure they deserved another chance. The cameras weren't even rolling yet. It was supposed to be a technical run-through, a chance to check lighting and blocking. But when she looked up and delivered the line, "You didn't save the world, you saved me, and that was enough," something in the room shifted. The crew went still. He forgot the next line. Because behind the fiction, it felt like she was speaking directly to him, thanking him for the years he had quietly carried her name into rooms where people wanted to erase her. He tried to answer with the scripted words, but his voice broke. There was no stunt to hide behind, no sunglasses, no green code raining down the walls. Just a man who had missed someone's laugh, someone's presence, more than he had ever allowed himself to admit. The director called for a break, but neither of them moved. She reached across the table, took his shaking hand, and didn't let go. For a few long seconds, Neo and Trinity disappeared. It was just two friends who had walked through grief, doubt, and the slow erosion of confidence, sitting together in the middle of a soundstage that suddenly felt very, very real. That was the moment they both knew they made the right choice. Not because the movie would be a hit, not because the world would cheer, but because they had chosen to come back with honesty instead of fear. On the Tonight Show couch, when he finishes telling that story, the studio is silent. No joke, no quick applause, just a shared, aching stillness. Then the audience rises slowly into a standing ovation that feels less like celebration and more like gratitude. And as they sit there, side by side, smiling through the emotion, you can almost feel it through the screen. The reminder that kindness can change a room, courage can bend a system, humility can carry a legend, and resilience, quiet, stubborn resilience, can bring two lost heroes home again. They were in one of the smaller stages that day, far from the massive sets with wires and green screens. No flying, no explosions, no elaborate combat, just a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, and a soft pool of light. It was a scene buried in the middle of the script, easy to miss on a first read. Neo and Trinity, older, scarred by time and choices, sitting across from each other after everything had gone wrong and then somehow impossibly right again. The call sheet labeled it dialogue, emotional reconnection. To the crew, it was a quieter day. To them, it would become the entire reason they had come back. They'd already run the lines a few times, technical and flat, just to find their marks. Cameras weren't rolling yet. This was meant to be a blocking rehearsal. A few crew members adjusted flags and bounced light. A grip whispered a joke to another at the edge of the set. The director watched from behind a small monitor, giving them room. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the stiffness that came with age and fight training. She pressed her palms against the table, grounding herself. They both knew the rhythm of scenes like this, how to slide into character, how to let the years between films melt away. But they also knew, though they hadn't said it out loud, that this scene scared them far more than any stunt. They started again. Neo, guarded but hopeful. Trinity, tired but still somehow brighter than the world around her. The dialogue moved like a hesitant dance, apologies half-formed, memories brushed against but not fully named. He spoke his lines with that careful, thoughtful cadence people recognized, but inside he could feel something pressing at the edges of the performance, something personal, impatient. She watched him with eyes that held both her character's history and their own. A shared life lived between takes, premieres, and long silences. Then she reached the line that would tear the day open. "You didn't save the world," she said softly, gaze locked on his. "You saved me, and that was enough." The words were written for Trinity to say to Neo, but in that moment they slipped past the script and landed somewhere deeper. The room changed without anyone moving. The soft hum of equipment seemed to hush itself. A focus puller froze mid-adjustment. Even the director's hand, halfway to his mouth with a cup of coffee, stilled in the air. Because the way she said it was not the way they had rehearsed it. Her voice carried something raw, gratitude, regret, a flicker of anger at the years they had almost let go to doubt. For him, time folded in on itself. He heard not just Trinity's voice, but hers. The woman who had been there through awkward early interviews, grueling 3 a.m. shoots, long drives back to the hotel in the dark while they whispered about life beyond the frame. He thought of the meetings she hadn't been invited to, the scripts that had stopped arriving so often, the way her name would sometimes be tagged onto his in-articles as if she were an accessory. He saw the conference room again, the executives hesitating when he'd drawn that line. No Trinity, no Neo. And in that moment, those 6 words, "You saved me, and that was enough," felt like a quiet acknowledgement of all the times he had tried, in his own flawed, stumbling ways, to push back against a system that treated her as optional. He opened his mouth to answer with the scripted reply, but the line evaporated. His throat tightened. Neo, the unshakable one, the calm center in a storm of bullets and code, suddenly couldn't remember what came next. His eyes blurred, and not from the stage lights. It was like the careful wall he'd built, between his grief and his work, between his public persona and his private ache, had been holding for years, and now one gentle sentence had cracked it from top to bottom. At the monitors, the director frowned, confused at first, then realized they weren't acting anymore. He lowered the coffee cup slowly. Around them, the crew shifted in uncomfortable stillness. This wasn't a blown line or a forgotten cue. This was something else, something fragile and dangerous, happening in the middle of a set where time was money and emotion was supposed to be controlled. He could have broken the moment with a joke. He could have cleared his throat, asked for the line, reset, slipped back into the safe distance of performance. Instead, he let the silence stretch. A single tear formed at the corner of his eye, and you could see him struggle, not against it, but with the decision to let the cameras, the crew, the world see him like this. Vulnerable, not as a character, but as a man who had carried losses and regrets and private loyalties for far too long. She didn't wait for direction. Trinity faded for a second, and it was just her, the friend who knew the backstory no one else had read. She reached across the table, fingers open, unsure if he would take the offered hand. When his own hand lifted, slightly trembling, and met hers halfway, a quiet exhale rippled through the room, like a collective breath nobody realized they were holding. Their fingers interlaced, and all the green code, all the slow motion shots, all the decades of myth fell away. Two people, not heroes, not icons, simply human, sat facing each other under a cone of light. The director finally called, "Hold, let's take a moment," his voice softer than usual, as if loudness might shatter something precious. No one moved to reset marks. No one rushed in with powder or notes. A boom operator looked away, giving them privacy inside a public space. Even the most cynical crew member, the one who had seen 100 emotional breakdowns on set, knew this was different. This wasn't ego or exhaustion. This was relief, a pressure valve finally turning. She squeezed his hand, eyes bright, not bothering to blink away the tears. In that close circle of connection, she thanked him without words. "Thank you for fighting for me in rooms I never saw. Thank you for not letting me disappear into some way. Thank you for believing I still had something to say when I'd nearly convinced myself I didn't." And he, in turn, silently thanked her for pulling him out of the quiet retreat he'd built around his pain, for showing up, for trusting him enough to step into the light again when it would have been so much easier to stay home, safe and unseen. When they finally ran the scene again, with cameras rolling this time, no one had to ask for more emotion or higher stakes. Every frame carried what had just happened between them when no one was supposed to be watching. The performance was cleaner, more controlled, but the truth remained threaded through every glance, every pause, like an invisible current. Later, in the editing room, when that scene appeared on the monitor, people would lean forward without knowing why, feeling a weight in their chest they couldn't quite name. On The Tonight Show, as he recounts this moment, he doesn't give every detail, but the essence comes through. He talks about forgetting his line, about taking her hand, about realizing that this return wasn't about reliving past glory. It was about telling a story that honored where they actually were in life, older, bruised, still standing. She adds that for the first time in a long time, she felt not like a guest in someone else's narrative, but like a full, necessary half of it. The host, usually eager to jump in with a quip, just watches them, his expression softer than the persona he wears for the camera. The studio audience goes quiet, drawn into that rehearsal room as if they'd been there standing against the back wall, watching these two people rediscover themselves. Some viewers at home see their own battles reflected in it. The friendship that held when careers wobbled, the second chance they were afraid to take, the moment they finally allowed themselves to be seen without armor. When the applause finally comes, it's not the sharp, automatic reaction to a punchline. It rises slowly from a place of recognition and respect. Sitting there under the bright late-night lights, side by side, they share a small, almost private smile. They know the movie will be judged by box office numbers, reviews, arguments online about whether it lived up to the original. But none of that can touch what that one rehearsal meant. In that quiet space, kindness had looked like one friend crossing a table. Courage had looked like not hiding the crack in his voice. Humility had looked like admitting they were scared of being forgotten or failing. And resilience had been the simple, stubborn choice to show up anyway, to do the work, to open the old wound and let it help someone else heal. Through the screen, you can feel the echo of that decision. You sense that behind all the CGI and choreography, the real story these two are telling, on set, on that couch, in every word they share, is that you are not too late, you are not a footnote, and you are never foolish for choosing to stand beside the people who once stood for you. And as the segment fades to commercial, the last image lingering in your mind is their joined presence. Two weary, luminous figures who stepped back into the spotlight not to prove they were still legends, but to prove that love, loyalty, and quiet, persistent bravery can outlast even the most carefully written ending.